The stage is set for the final season at the Ralph. We're taking a look at the Bills' 2025 schedule this week on the Wandering Buffalo podcast.
You're now listening to the Wandering Buffalo podcast with your host, Justin Goddard.
Bills Mafia, welcome into another episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast, a show on the Buffalo FamBase podcast network. My name is Justin, and I'm your host, and today we're going to be looking at the Bills' 2025 schedule, and I'm sure if you made it far enough that you found this show, you've already taken a look at it yourself. You have some of your own thoughts on what you think about the path for the Bills in 2025. And we're just going to kind of work through some of my thoughts today, give you my feelings about what I like about the schedule and what I don't like. And honestly, I kind of like the way the schedule is setting up for the Bills. And I will say at the top of this episode, if you're somebody that's listened to the show for a long time, you know that I'm not somebody that gets, too high or too low on the schedule and how it shakes out and all the different rest advantages and things like that. I think all those things do matter. Don't get me wrong. I kind of look at it more as everybody in the league is kind of dealing with their own variety of these things in different ways. And I look at it from the position of the Bills have been able to organizationally put together a team that has been and is consistently in the conversation of a team that can win it all. So ultimately, there's pros and cons to each schedule. There's going to be different, I guess I'll call it like ebbs and flows to how seasons will go. But at the end of the day, we have the talent on this team to play with anybody on any given day, on any given location, on different rest advantages, all that kinds of stuff. So I guess ultimately I do have like opinions on how much I like certain parts of the schedule, but for me it doesn't change much as to how the schedule comes out, what my expectations will be for this team. So that being said, I want to dive into schedule, and we are starting off the season with a straight banger. Sunday night football, first primetime game, and we have the Baltimore Ravens coming to town. And I feel like there is a chance that this is kind of a tone setter for the season. I think that it is probably the opponent that I wanted to see week one the least. I think that Baltimore matches up against Buffalo very well. They have kind of leaned into that two-headed running back monster between Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry. And I think just for a Bills team that is revamping that D-line, a game that, looking through the first 6 games here, I don't have a ton of concerns. We'll get to that. But for a matchup that I was excited to see how the new players coming in and Larry Ogunjobi and Michael Hoyt, how they could kind of change how we defend some teams. I think Baltimore was kind of the perfect matchup to be able to kind of use those players in the roles that I'm kind of envisioning for them. And I kind of wanted to see how that product all is coming together, particularly against the Ravens, because I think that's where they'll have their biggest impact. Unfortunately, we won't get to see that. Maybe we'll get a chance to see what it looks like come playoff time. I think this is very similar to how things have been with the Chiefs, it kind of seems like it's an inevitable collision course that we're going to run into these guys again in the playoffs. So maybe we'll get to see it the second time around. For this first matchup, I think that it kind of is going to force you to lean into some of these rookies that we've brought in and kind of see where they're at. See, you know, how they develop throughout training camp and preseason, and week one playing under the lights, and you have all these big investments. You know, no bones about it. You really invested in the defensive side of the ball, and even more particularly the defensive line. So that's going to be a big game for these guys to come in and kind of showcase where they're at and why the team invested in them. Week two, headed to New Jersey to take on the Jets. This is a game that I find kind of interesting. I mean, obviously, you're playing the Jets twice, so there's going to be one a little bit earlier in the season, one later in the season, typically. I mean, looking at last year, I think it wasn't till week 13, something like that, that we saw New England for the first time. We ended up playing them like twice in 3 weeks, something like that. I don't have overwhelming concerns about threats that the Jets pose. I think that pretty much top to bottom, the Bills are going to end up having a better roster than the Jets. But they do have an interesting dynamic of Justin Fields coming in to play quarterback, presumably, and just that dual threat ability that he has. He doesn't really scare me as a passer, but he kind of brings the variance and the unknown in that dynamic ability as a runner. And I think that's something that I would have rather had the team get a little bit more tape on to be able to have an understanding of how the Jets kind of want to deploy this offense. So I think it'll be an interesting dynamic there. Ultimately, until proven otherwise, I don't have much concern for the Jets. And honestly, to a lesser extent, our division, I do think there's some changes within the division, but we've pretty much had a stranglehold on this. I know that teams change every year. I know that teams find ways to improve and particularly try to compete within the division. I haven't seen enough from the Jets that I have any sort of concern here. Week 3, we have Thursday night football with the Miami Dolphins coming into town. This is one that I'm a little bummed about, but it also kind of has the scale kind of evens out for me. I really enjoy when the warm weather teams have to come into Buffalo late in the season. I think it's a fun dynamic as long as you're a fan of the team that's used to the cold. But having them come to Orchard Park early in the season, we at least get the other side of it where we're not playing them till, later in the year. Hopefully we're not dealing with one of those games where it's 90 degrees and no shade on the sideline and people are heat stroking. So hopefully the scales kind of even out there. I do think Miami poses some interesting challenges, particularly if they have a healthy Tua, which week 3, you'd hope he's still healthy for his sake. I do think that Miami kind of hit their peak and it ended quickly, and they've kind of been trending in the wrong direction. I do think that this off season, they kind of moved away from their philosophy of just building this like finesse team that, was so predicated on speed that we saw and they were dangerous for that reason, but it kind of had its limitations. And it seems like this offseason they wanted to kind of build more of a physical nature to the team. I'll also be excited for this game to be able to see my biggest draft crush, Kenneth Grant, still just not only gutted that the Bills didn't have a chance at him, but did he have to go to Miami? So we'll get to take a look at Kenneth Grant for the first time. Second primetime game in 3 weeks to start the season. Will also be, our first short week here. So short week there, taking on Miami, and then you get a little bit of a longer break headed into week 4 with New Orleans coming to town. And New Orleans is just, they're in a very interesting spot, and we'll see what they look like by week 4, but I don't think this is going to be a team that's going to give me a ton of concern. I do want to put the caveat out there that every team in the NFL gives me some level of concern. It's professional football. We see teams lose to teams that they shouldn't lose to all the time. It happens. I'm looking at this of, they have Derek Carr unexpectedly retire on him. They have Spencer Rattler that was a mid-round pick 2 years ago, and they drafted Tyler Shuck this year. I believe it was in the second round. So I do think that there is maybe some long-term ceiling there for them as a team. But being that you had Derek Carr under contract, I don't think the plan was for this guy to be starting week 1. I think it was kind of, let's start grooming him. We're going to get out of this Derek Carr contract eventually, and hopefully he's ready to play by then. Whole new dynamic if, he's your day 1 starter. And for coming out of a quarterback class that wasn't the most impressive quarterback class that we've ever seen, we'll see how it all shakes out. But week 4, New Orleans coming into town. That's a team I'm glad to face earlier in the season than later. Who knows what happens? Maybe the rookie catches fire, and, by the tail end of the season, they're rattling off some wins. Who knows? I would rather get a team like that early in the season while they're still kind of figuring out how everything's going to work and how they just gel all together as an offensive unit behind a new quarterback. So, interesting one there. Week 5, another primetime game. I'm going to throw this part of this out there just while we're really exploring the primetime games, because as you've noticed, they really front-loaded the Bills' schedule with the primetime games, which I don't really understand. I believe it's 5 total primetime games that we have. Let me see. So I believe it's 5 total, and we have, 4 of them before the bye week. So pretty interesting scheduling there. I don't know how it all shakes out. I'm sure it's a really complicated formula to make all these puzzle pieces fit, but we got them nice and early and out of the way for me. Personally, I am not a huge fan of primetime games. I'm a little bit old. I think primetime games are pretty brutal on East Coast times. I got to be up early on Mondays. I like Sunday at 1:00. It's my least favorite thing about having a team that's been consistently good is they don't hide us in the 1:00 slots very much anymore. And Maybe it's because I'm old and I don't like the late games. Maybe it's, part of like the tradition of how I grew up watching football. But to me, that the time slot I want to watch football is Sunday at 1 o'clock. We don't get a ton of those. So week 5, we got New England coming into town, Sunday night football. I think this will be an interesting matchup because I do think of all the teams in our division, New England made the biggest strides towards getting better. I do think that there is kind of an asterisk on that because they had so much room to improve. But I think it's an interesting roster the way it's shaping up. I think they're going to be a better coach team under Vrabel. And I think Drake May showed a lot of promise as a rookie in what he was able to accomplish with very little support around him. I don't think they had a very good roster at all last year. I could see the Bills still being very dominant in the division, but if we're going to slip up against one of the teams, I could see it being New England. I think Vrabel will be willing to coach up like a dogfight defensive battle, and those are games that can kind of get away from you in weird ways. I think that the Jets don't scare me at all, and I think Miami is more looking for offense versus offense, and I'll take mine over theirs every day of the week. So I think if there is room to be gotten in the division, I could see it being New England sneaking one from us. Week 5, and then week 6. Yes, so we got another primetime game. This one is in Atlanta on Monday Night Football, so a little extra day of rest there. Headed into an opponent that, I'll be honest, this one does give me a little concern. And I think there's still a lot for Atlanta to figure out. I think that they still have a lot to prove. But Michael Penix played pretty well for them last year. Was able to keep the starting job from Kirk Cousins, who they're paying a lot of money. I think their defense still has a lot of question marks, but they, made some pretty significant investments on defense this year. Where I have concern here is I think the way they want to run their offense matches up well to how the Bills play defense. And that being a running back in Bijan Robinson that really can do everything. He's fast, he's physical, he's shifty, he catches the ball. You got Drake London, who's had a great start to his career. Who knows with Kyle Pitts? I think there's opportunities for, if they play the right style of football, for them to pose some interesting matchup problems for the Bills. But that's your first 6 games there. One thing that I don't really like about this schedule is, well, first of all, like I already mentioned, heavy on the primetime games to start the season, but also pretty heavy on the home games here. 4 of 6 to start the season at home. And, just adds to the amount of travel on the back end of the season. I think it kind of works out this year just because the Bills aren't doing some outrageous traveling. And by week 7, this is a good time for me to drop my thoughts about the bigger picture of the schedule, things that I really love about the schedule. And this is why I weigh much heavily towards really liking the schedule than having complaints. We came away, no holiday games, not even like a Black Friday game. There's no international game. We have 2 Thursday night football games. I don't love that. But there's also no West Coast travel here. I think the farthest we have to travel is to Houston. Not too shabby. Might also be, I think that's also the only game that is in a different time zone. So pretty sweet for the traveling that we have to do, that there's not really any sort of outrageous travel demands. Coming off the bye, we have week 8 headed to Carolina. We got a 1 p.m. game. Love to see that. And I actually really love this placement of Carolina in our schedule. And this is going to go back to my point that there's not anybody in the league that I take lightly. I like seeing the Joe Brady approach of, you know, the 1-0 posts. I like taking every game individually and giving every opponent their due respect. But they're a team that hasn't been good for quite some time. We see some flashes from Bryce Young, but I don't think he is ever going to be like a marquee franchise quarterback that just like can beat you by himself. I think he does a good job of getting the ball into playmakers' hands and letting them produce after the catch. But he's not really a quarterback that strikes fear in me. And spoke at the top of the show about the Ogunjobi and Michael Hoyt suspensions. So they can now be with the team for 2 weeks, I believe it is, to start practicing before returning from suspension. So they would have 2 weeks to start practicing with the team, then the bye week to continue working with the team. And then the first game that we can see them in action is against Carolina. So I think you can kind of get them calloused with the practice, with that ramp up practice time. And then hopefully things playing out as they should. You're going into this Carolina game with a pretty solid record. It's not a team that is a world beater that you have to have your absolute best foot forward for, likely. And you can get them some game action there and see where they're at, see how much you can rely on them going into the week 9 matchup, which is one that's going to be circled on the calendar for everybody. And that's Kansas City coming into town for a 4:25 kickoff. And I like the idea of being able to see them get some game action. I wouldn't have liked it if their first game that they were able to play was Kansas City. And, you know, there can be a ton of meaning on that game for playoff seeding, and versus it being an NFC opponent that, you know, half the time these NFC games, they really only matter if you get a win. The losses don't hurt you as much for tiebreakers, seedings, all that stuff. So I like getting Carolina before Kansas City. I like where Kansas City's at. We're kind of fresh off of a break. And I honestly, that's always going to be a marquee game as long as Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes are playing quarterback. I don't really give a hoot if we win or lose that game, other than the implications for tiebreakers, playoff seedings, all that stuff. I want to beat Kansas City in the playoffs. And I think it's great that I think it's like Bills are 4-1 in the regular season against the Chiefs and then 0-4 in the playoffs. It's really hard to beat a team twice in one season. If we had the benefit of hindsight and you could tell me that, yeah, we took the Chiefs out in the playoffs and we beat them in the regular season, sure. If we take a loss to them in the regular season, I don't really care. I want to knock them off in the playoffs. I want to beat them in the playoffs like almost as much as I want the Bills to end up in the Super Bowl. I understand that that's probably going to be part of the path to getting to the Super Bowl, but I'm so sick of losing to them in the playoffs and them ending our season in dramatically traumatic fashions. So week 9, can't really get myself to care about the outcome too much. I'm figuring both teams are going to end up in the playoffs. Both teams are going to be up there in favorites to win it all, and I want to be the one to end their season. Week 10, kind of touched on this one earlier. Get to head into Miami a little bit later in the season. 1 o'clock kickoff. I think I've said all I really had to say about Miami. I think those division games are always have a different layer of being closer than you might expect them to be. But I think Miami, like I said, has kind of hit the peak of what they were building. They're coming down. They're on the wrong side of that. And now they're kind of in a spot where they're doing like a little bit of a reset with the team, kind of building out with different skill sets, different archetype players. And for me, if they're not getting results with these changes early in the season, by the time we get to week 10, we might be talking about, how secure is their coach. It's just the way it goes in the NFL. I don't know if that conversation should be had. I guess it would ultimately depend on how everything goes leading into week 10. But I think that they've had some leash, they've had some success, and they've been trending in the wrong direction. So I could see a world where we're talking about jobs being on the line by the time we get to week 10. Week 11, Tampa Bay coming into town. Another 1 p.m. kickoff. I love that. I don't love... it's another Florida team. I would rather that be later in the season, make them come play in the cold. But I think this is shaping up to possibly be a really fun game. And I'm honestly really surprised that this ends up in a 1 o'clock time slot. You have a team in Tampa Bay. They've won their division for, I believe it's the last 4 years. The Bills winning their division for the last 5 years. I think Baker Mayfield has really revived his career with Tampa Bay, and I don't think he gets talked about enough for how good he's been in Tampa Bay. Put up something like 40 touchdowns and 4,500 yards last year, and that's on a team that dealt with, pretty significant injuries at the receiver position. We know Chris Godwin missed a good chunk of the season. Dude's a gunslinger, and I think Tampa has a pretty solid defense, but I feel like this one could end up being like one of the highest scoring games in the league in the year. And, sometimes I have that expectation and it ends up being the team's plan for that too. And it ends up being a defensive stalemate where neither team wants to be the one to blink first. But I think you have two quarterbacks in that matchup that are willing to throw the ball all over the field. And like I said, I think that could end up being a high scoring affair. Week 12, like I said, I believe this is the furthest travel that we have. So I guess you can not love that this one is on a short week, but headed to Houston for a Thursday night game. Like I said, I can't really complain about any traveling in with this schedule that we have lined up for us. But what I will complain about is a second Thursday night football game. I don't care for Thursday night football games. I think it brings a really weird dynamic to the game. I think we see bad football on Thursday nights. Clearly, the NFL doesn't care all that much about it because they stuck to it. That's not going away. So I'll take it in stride and deal with it as we have to. But the less Thursday night games I can see, the better. That being said, I think there's some interesting dynamics to the Houston game. I think this is kind of uh, uh, a year for CJ Stroud to really show who he is. I think he looked really good in his rookie year. We were talking about, just how great this dude is. His second year, kind of a little bit of a mixed bag. So going into year three, I think it's going to be a big year for him. I think that'll pose an interesting matchup. Ultimately, another game that I don't think the Bills can't handle. Week 13 headed into Pittsburgh for a 4:25 kickoff. I mean, I don't really know what to make of this game right now. As of the recording of this podcast, it's seemingly Mason Rudolph is the plan. I'm not really buying that. I do think that there's a good chance that they end up, coming to terms with Aaron Rodgers, and that's who we get to see, provided he'd be healthy even by this point of the season. And I think there's a lot of infrastructure in place in Pittsburgh that could pose a concerning matchup. I mean, we've kind of seen Pittsburgh's the way it plays out every year is they build up this pretty nice roster, and they've had pretty bad quarterback play between, the talent they have and a good defense. They're able to get into the playoffs and then get stomped by somebody. So does that dynamic change a little bit with an Aaron Rodgers in the fold? Maybe. But 40-something-year-old Aaron Rodgers isn't really striking fear into me either. Week 14, Cincinnati coming into town for a 4:25 kickoff. This is one that I would have rather had earlier in the season. I think they're a weird organization. I think they tend to start a little bit slow, and we saw this, pretty crazy run they put together last year. I would rather have to deal with them early in the season while they're figuring things out than later in the season. But here we are. Week 15 headed into New England for a 1:00 kickoff. Again, kind of mirroring some of the things that I said about our first matchup with them and the asterisk of this being further into the season. I think we're going to have a pretty good idea of who New England is by this time of the year. And, maybe the pieces are coming together a little bit more. You're headed into Foxborough. Depending on what records look like, there's a world where the Bills could be playing for not a ton by week 15 or kind of just buttoning things up. I could see a world where New England is really fighting and scratching and clawing for a chance at a playoff spot if things kind of go right with them. So I think this is a sneaky game to watch out for on the schedule. And when I talk about, the idea that New England could steal one from us, I think it would be that week 15 game. Week 16 in Cleveland. I have no idea what to do with that game. I'm going to, until further notice, not have much concern about that game. I think Cleveland's been an ass backwards franchise for a very long time. And who's playing quarterback? And is there a world where it's Watson again? Probably not. Is it Dylan Gabriel? Is it Shador? Did they try Dylan Gabriel and switch to Shador by this point to see what they have because the season's going terribly? I don't know. I don't know what to do with Cleveland. Uh, they the one thing that I'll say about Cleveland is I was having a conversation with one of my buddies about, teams failing quarterbacks more than quarterbacks failing teams. And all the praise that I just piled on Baker Mayfield, and that's a dude that they just let go so they could bring in Watson. I don't think they know how to run their franchise very well. And another team that, until proven otherwise, I have no concerns about. Week 17, interesting matchup with Philadelphia coming to town, Super Bowl champions. I think it's an interesting game to put this late in the season when you're looking at two teams that can conceivably play each other in the Super Bowl, conceivably. So who knows? Maybe this is something where we end up looking at we have to play Philly twice in 5 weeks. Be a good problem to have, but I think this game would make more sense earlier in the season, especially with two teams that, you know, I are going to be projected to be pretty high seeded playoff teams. So the opportunity you have for that game to be like a super marquee matchup, and you're putting in a week where it might be that that game doesn't matter for much, especially with them being an NFC opponent. You know, for both teams, whether that game is won and lost, it's probably not going to do a ton to affect the seeding. And then the Bills round out the regular season. Week 18, the time is to be determined against the Jets. Jets are coming in for the final regular season game in our current stadium. Again, I don't really know what the plan is for the Jets. I think they have some interesting dynamics. It could very well be that the Bills aren't really playing for anything in week 18, but whether they are or not, I would like to see the team go out with a win for the last regular season game in their stadium. But that's it. That's the outlook for the 2025 season. Just kind of with all those dynamics, the way the opponents are shaken out and everything, I see this being, something like a 13-win season. I think if you're anything below like 12, that would be probably a pretty big disappointment. I see the team winning 13, 14 games. I think the way all of this schedule sets up, it shapes up nicely for hopefully finally getting the 1 seed, getting that wild card week rest, especially with the bye week being a little bit earlier. I'm okay with week 7. I prefer like week 11 range, something after week 10. But with the bye week being a little bit earlier, it'd be really nice to lock in that 1 seed, get a little bit of extra rest. But for me, the biggest thing about that week 1 bye is how banged up our team has gotten having to play in the wild card game over the past couple seasons. So I would like to just avoid that game altogether. But that's going to do it for this week's episode. More episodes to come. So make sure you like, share, subscribe, tell a friend about the show. Fun fact about myself, today was my last day of my school semester. So hopefully crazy scheduling things and weird drop times will stop and we'll be able to get back to a consistent schedule. Appreciate everybody giving me some grace as, I move through this semester. Like I said, either way, make sure you're subscribed and you won't ever miss an episode. And it'll be great for me. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. We will talk to you next week. Until then, and as always, go Bills.